Wow, what an introduction. Thank you. What a room. Um, thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be here today. Can you hear me in the back? And there's chairs here. If you want need chairs, please come up. So my name is Tuong Vu, and I'm also came from a country that no longer is on the map. If you were here this morning, Penguin from Lana asking a question about, Lana, which is no longer on the map, and I'm from South Vietnam, which is also no longer on the map. It's my first time here, at the UW, and I, just half a day already so impressed by all of you, by the quality of knowledge, by the diversity of the faculty and students, and so on. So I've been so impressed, and many questions in the morning, in the panel this morning, kind of resonate a lot with me. For example, I also write about dead people. This morning someone mentioned that, right? And I was also, I've been in this country since 1990 for a long time, but I came here when I was 25, and somehow I've never been able to adjust it to life here. So there's a question of home and alienation from home. Like this morning, there were many panelists talking about, how they came from Southeast Asia and how they feel like alienated in America and so on. So I'm alienated from home. That's why I came here as a refugee. By the way, I did study political science in Vietnam. There's no such a discipline in Vietnam. I studied English, but it's so alienated from home. Not quite at home here after 35 years or so. Like these questions that the panelists discussed this morning really kind of resonate with me. And I also, have tried to find my own fit in this. Like the question of, writing in English or writing in your own native language, for example, this morning someone brought up that issue. And consider it's a political decision, right? In Thailand, for example, and for me, it's also a political decision, but it's kind of different because the Vietnamese state, they follow me very closely, and if I write in Vietnamese, they pay even more attention because I can influence Vietnamese in Vietnam. If I write English, maybe they care, maybe they don't. And because, also because they don't read English, or because, I'm not going to affect the situation in Vietnam. So that's also a political decision as well. So that just, for you to see how I'm so impressed by the discussion this morning and how I'm from Oregon, where there are only 2 Southeast Asianists in the faculty for the whole university, right? So very few students from Southeast Asia, they're studying engineer or business, and so I've never had really kind of an experience like this for a long time. So I really appreciate being here, even though my talk may disappoint you, but I hope it's not too bad.
Yeah.
So exactly 50 years ago this month, war ended in Vietnam in 1975, April, right, with the fall of Saigon. So for many Americans, it was a moment of relief. It was the end of their country's misadventure. It was time to move on. But for millions of South Vietnamese, it was just one disaster after another. It was the end of one disaster. It was the beginning of another disaster for the next decade. So I was there as a child, 10 years old, and just follow the victory So the new regime started to get rid of the people of the old regime, which is natural, but you can't expect that, sending them away. The original intention is not for them to return, and actually many, spent 20 years in prison after the war, and that affected, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, because the Saigonese army and government, they had perhaps like few 100,000 people and so on. So after the direct enemy came the intellectuals, the religious leaders, the writers, the artists, who the new regime knows were anti-communist. They were the next to be rounded up and sent to re-education camps. And after them came the corporate leaders, the private business owners, thousands of them, and not necessarily, being very rich, but they own businesses, and so their businesses were taken from them without justice. And many of them, many of them were ethnic Chinese actually, and many of them were sent to the countryside to learn how to farm. And then came the middle class. So the new regime, they wanted to achieve social equality, which is a great ideal. But then what they did was to have it happen overnight. By what? By currency exchange, right? So each household was allowed to exchange only a very limited amount of cash. And Vietnamese society was not a society with, like financial services being very developed. So most people have either cash or gold. So with cash, you were allowed to exchange only a small number of amount of cash. And the next day, everyone was equally being poor, right? Because the middle class was the one that suffered the most from that. Then came the farmers. So farmers, like in North Vietnam, were forced into cooperatives, meaning to turn your own land, the land of your ancestors and parents, to the cooperatives, to the government, which until today still own them, not returning them. Even after 3 decades of market reform, government has refused to return the land that took from the farmers back then. This kind of depressing enough, but following next is the war. So as the communist revolution was going on, new wars began. War between Vietnam and Cambodia, between China and Cambodia and Vietnam. So the anti-imperialist powers, after having defeated the imperialist powers, which was the US, they turned against each other. Only 4 years later. And I still remember when I was in middle school, one day around 1979, the school set up a table by the school gate, and all the students who came in were asked to sign a pledge to join the military when they reach the draft age. That was 1979, when Vietnam was fighting both Cambodia and China. And these were, Vietnamese allies, and they were not the imperialists like the US. So it's kind of, unimaginable, unthinkable. It's kind of difficult. It's kind of so stupid, right? For that to happen. But then that's not all. And sorry, it's depressing, but I try to be inclusive here, even though it's so I don't want to forget anything. So next were the Bo people. So why this war was going on, like every month, thousands of Vietnamese arriving on the shores of Malaysia and Indonesia every month, thousands of them. So it's the largest crisis, of refugee in the history up to then. When Vietnamese were just they just could not stand the communist dictatorship and tried to flee Vietnam. And many perished along the way, including my two best friends in high school. Never made it, tried to get out, never made it. But I want political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Wei actually in their recent study argue that one of the main reasons that revolutionary dictatorships last for so long compared to other forms of dictatorship is because of the early violence they carry out against potential social centers of opposition. So if you destroy landlord, if you destroy capitalists, if you destroy intellectuals, if you destroy writers, if you put all of them in jail or send them to the countryside, your dictatorship is going to last for a long time. Eventually they would collapse, you would collapse, but then that's going to be decades. So that's the argument, and it's great to see that coming out. But I would argue that, so like I say, it's not going to last forever. So today I'm going to go back to history, like almost 100 years of history of Vietnam, to look at how that was not expected to be Vietnam's destiny in the 1920s or 30s, and may not be Vietnam's destiny in the future. So in this talk, I try to address 4 questions. What is the current status of political freedom in Vietnam? How did modern political concepts first come to Vietnam? What distinguishes Republican and Communist thoughts? What were past attempts and achievements in democratic mobilization? And what are current challenges and prospects? First, what is the current status of political freedom in Vietnam? So I must admit that for this I took the shortcut by just kind of pulling some data from some organizations that have done this kind of work for a while, just to put Vietnam in some perspective, right? Some comparative perspective. And here you have North Korea to the left, Vietnam in the middle, and Thailand to the right. And you could see that Vietnam is somewhere in the middle, and it's doing much better than North Korea, but not as well as Thailand on most indicators in terms of global democratic performance. And in terms of the press, Vietnam is actually closer to North Korea than to Thailand, as you can see from the indicators. It's very close to North Korea and close to China, countries at the bottom of the list. And this organization also do the thing they call real-time abuses, and you could see that the number of journalists in Vietnam actually outperform both North Korea and Thailand by this indicator, with the number of journalists being detained numbering 37 at this point. Just kind of give you a sense of what the kind of laws, we talked about laws with Tiro yesterday, the kind of laws that they use to put these democracy activists, environmental activists, or gender activists in jail, abusing freedom and democracy, threatening national security, harming public order, terrorists, sabotaging national unity, and so on. And the number actually increased to 2,058 in 2023, but I couldn't find the report. So the next question, so the situation in terms of democracy and political freedom is kind of dismal, right? Kind of depressing. But it wasn't meant to be. So going back to the 1920s, that was not the case. So the French conquest, we know that Vietnam was under French rule for about 80 years, and the French conquest actually made southern Vietnam into a colony, but they still kept the emperor, the king of Vietnam, kind of in control of central and northern Vietnam, and so the monarchy still maintained some power, but then its it already lost most of its popular legitimacy and loyalty. And the more important thing is the cultural change. So the mentality of the people for hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years or more, they were under the influence of the Chinese culture. We call it scenic culture. And so, so the elites and the ordinary people, they thought in terms of, these Chinese concepts. But then the French came and then taught them new concepts and broke the hold of the scenic worldview on most Vietnamese. And so Vietnamese began to discover Republican ideas through French, Chinese, and Japanese sources around the 1900s, whereas communist ideas were imported from Russia and French in the 1920s. So, if you are Vietnamese today and you learn history in school, you would learn that communism was the destiny of Vietnam. And some foreign scholars also make the same argument. It's like, the communists just continue the tradition of Vietnamese anti-foreign resistance and so on. But that kind of skipped over a big part of the 1920s and before, when Republican ideas, Republican political movements spread to Vietnam through Chinese language, because Chinese scholars like Han Yo-wei and Len Chi-chao, right? They translated Western concepts from Japanese and so on, and they were imported into Vietnam. An example of Republican thinking from Mr. Bùi Quang Chiêu, who established the Constitutionalist Party in South Vietnam. So you could see in his comment in his group comment on what Vietnamese want. So they want representative government, they want citizenship, they want freedom to publish, freedom of speech, they want self-government, they want a constitution, right? So these are the things that they learned from the French, the West, and they began to ask the French for these things. And then many scholars and activists like Phan Chu Trinh, who spent many years in prison, and then later on went to live in France, they were sharply criticizing the monarchy. This is kind of an example of how Vietnamese at the time were embracing Western ideas and blaming the monarchy for causing Vietnam to be a colony and all these backwardness. So he's attacking the monarchy, and if the monarch has so much power, then we just gonna be like animals. We just be a herd of goats. And if there are Thai scholars here, and it's very similar to what Preedy, right? Preedy was accusing the Thai monarchy in the 1930s, right? So Vietnam also had the absolutist monarchy. And Phan Chu Trinh was criticizing that. And Phạm Quỳnh, who was the Mandarin and also an intellectual and journalist, he was proposing a constitutional monarchy. So he was looking at Japan and England and said that, they were much better than the United States. Look at the United States, it's causing serious disruption to if you change the president every 4 years, it's a lot of trouble, it's a lot of disruption that we are feeling right now, right? So say, look at Japan and England, I mean, they world leaders, and they don't have to do that, right? So why don't we do like them? Why don't we have this constitutional monarchy? They're fine, monarchy is fine, it's not that bad. Then came Ho Chi Minh, who imported communists together with other leaders into Vietnam in the 1930s. So he's clearly a revolutionary. At first he was traveling, and then he became radicalized while living in France in the 1920s, and went to the Soviet Union for training in 1923, and then was studied at the Stalin School in Moscow. participated in the Third International, came back to Vietnam, came back to southern China to work as a Southeast Asian agent for the Comintern for decades. And he was, calling for Vietnam to learn from Russian Revolution to carry out a radical revolution to be a socialist country, to help to join the global communist movement, to overthrow global capitalism and imperialism. So both sides have lofty goals, but then the communists were a lot more radical, as you could see from the side-by-side comparison. So Republicans ask for self-rule, and they're generally anti-monarchy and anti-clergy, right? This came from French tradition and so on. But the communists went much further. They were anti not only colonialism but also imperialism, right? That's a step further. And they were not only anti the king and the mandarins, but also anti-landlords, which they consider being part of this feudalist system that oppressed the people, oppressed the peasants, and so on. So they were anti-feudalists, and they also anti-religion, as we have seen in the Soviet Union, in China and Vietnam. So I don't need to talk about that. Whereas for Republicans, it's secularism, right? So religion should not intervene into state matters and vice versa. Both sides agree about popular sovereignty, but then Republicans call for constitutional legal order, whereas the communists want to build a class-based social order. And just to kind of expand the ideas between the differences. So private ownership is important. Individual over collective rights and interests important for Republicans. Majority rule determined by tariff individual votes. Multiple parties, representative governments. Whereas on the communist side, you have public ownership because they blame private ownership of economic means as the root cause of all social inequality, right? So that's what communists believe in. And when they took power, they tried to turn everything into publicly owned, if they could. Collective rights over individual rights, and the proletariat, or sometimes the working people, were considered the largest and most progressive or revolutionary classes, so they deserve to rule over society, and the rest should just comply. And the self-appointed party state embodies the collective and enforces unity. So you could see that the dangers coming from authoritarianism from both sides, right? So for the Republicans, it's social inequality. If the rich are so rich, they have money to buy votes and buy power and dominate people. Populism, we know. For the communists, it's the party state. That poses the largest danger to freedom. All right, so that was the beginning, right? So the beginnings were promising, with this flourishing of various ideas, and the Republicans were the majority. The communists operated on the fringe. Many of them were, because they were so radical, the French, kind of tried to destroy the Communist Party and oppress them the most. So many of them, spent time abroad or in prison, whereas Republicans had the more freedom to organize and work. So that's why they were a lot more popular. But also, the radical ideas were not familiar to Vietnamese political culture, and that's why they were not so well received by most people. Then came, but that was not the end of the story, because throughout Vietnamese history, we've seen a few moments in which Republican ideas were adopted and implemented. And I'm going to go through two or three of these. We are running out of time, right?
Okay, just
I'm okay. And all the moments, I want to point out the similarities between them. All of them take place during changing global and national order, in which the authorities confronted serious challenges to their legitimacy, forcing them to open up the political system, to have for people to have more freedom. And that's the lesson, we learn from, Western countries as well. It's not just Vietnam. And then there was also a surge in the strength of civil society as accompanied these moments. So the first liberal Republican moment took place when the Japanese occupation was still in place in mid-1945. So the Japanese occupied Vietnam, overthrew French rule, and then they allow the King of Vietnam and Vietnamese government to be formed while they were still there watching. And so Tuong Kim and there was actually only one scholar who have studied this government in detail, and that was a graduate of this program, history. And his name is Tuong Vu, and he was a student of John Smale, but decades ago. And he did not publish his whole dissertation, but published a chapter in Journal of Asian Studies on this Tuong Kim government. And so Tuong Kim government is often dismissed as a Japanese puppet, but they were not. They were in power for only 5 months, but they firstly declared Vietnam's independence from France. They founded the council to draft the constitution. They lifted most restrictions on political activities and press, and they released political prisoners, including many communists who went on to overthrow them. But in September, they were kind of in a weak position because they were seen by the West as being associated with the Japanese, just like you study Sukarno and Hatta in Japan. Yeah, they were in the same position, right? But they managed to stay. But then Tuong Kim could not. So yielded to Ho Chi Minh, who took leadership. He cited the U.S. Constitution in his Declaration of Independence, but then imposed restrictions on freedom and political activism, tried to arrest, execute, assassinate political rivals, including Phan Quỳnh, which you saw earlier, and Bùi Quang Chiêu. Both of them were executed within a month or two after the communists took over. Organized the election of a constituent assembly and drafted a Republican constitution, allowing limited participation of opposition parties under the Chinese pressure, because these parties were supported by Chinese nationalist government, and which at the time was occupying northern Vietnam. So under that pressure, the Ho Chi Minh government had to give them some seats, and they also contributed to draft a relatively liberal, but not the most liberal constitution of Vietnam. But it's pretty good constitution. I'm going to pass this one. It was in the 1950s, and when Ngô Đình Diệm came back, and then he also opened up the political system, and for a while, opposition parties were permitted, but harassed. The 1956 constitution was as good as the 1946 constitution. It gives more power to the executive, but it has a clearer separation of power, and at the same time it gives more role to the judiciary. So on balance, both are the same. Even this one follow the presidential model, whereas the other one follow the parliamentary model. Second liberal moment in North Vietnam, 1956, with the Nhân Văn Giải Phóng movement. When Khrushchev, when de-Stalinization began in the Soviet Union and throughout the communist bloc, so the communist government of North Vietnam was also shaken by that, and so there was a lot of criticisms on about the brutal land reform before, about the the tight control of Reuters and the code of personality of Ho Chi Minh. But then, the rebellions happened in Poland and Hungary later in the year, and Khrushchev, we know, sent tanks into Hungary to crush the rebellion, and the Vietnamese did the same. So did the Chinese, right, with the 100 Flowers movement. So we were seeing, like similar events kind of occurring throughout the communist bloc at the time. The third liberal moment took place after Ngô Đình Diệm was overthrown in the military coup with a significant participation of civil society in the form of Buddhist protest. And it was also a critical time, in Vietnamese history with, U.S. was trying to intervene, and it's at the height of the Cold War. So the military government overthrew Ngô Đình Diệm, but then they did not have legitimacy. Just like Park Chung-hee in South Korea. So if you study like these Asian countries, you see many very similar parallels. So they sought legitimacy and stability by lifting restrictions on political parties and the press. They organized a free and fair election for multi-party constituent assembly, draft a new anti-communist liberal constitution in 1967, organized elections which, as assessed by many foreign observers at the time, were the freest and fairest elections in Vietnamese history. And so, like in one of the one of the books I'm writing with two other scholars, we consider this a constitutional revolution, just like what happened in Thailand, more or less in the 1930s, or in Turkey earlier, in Iran earlier in the century. South Vietnam also had a constitutional revolution, and we call it revolution because it came directly from below. Right, came out of these Buddhist, student, Catholic, various groups that were protesting and demanding a voice and representation, and the military government eventually had to yield to their demand, which created this constitution. So these are the images of the election in 1967. And just kind of a distribution of seats in the assembly in South Vietnam, 1974, across various coalitions. So the Republican bloc in the House was pro-government, but then the Nation and Society bloc was against the government. In the Senate, the Democratic bloc was pro-government, but the Unity bloc was against. And Saigon actually has the freest press in Southeast Asia, except Bangkok, after 1973, right? After the overthrow of General from Thanom. Yeah. So this came from a journalist, American journalist based in Saigon, who was very critical of South Vietnamese political system. But he was saying that in South Vietnamese press was the freest, except Hong Kong, which was a British colony, and Bangkok, which experienced a change in government. And it was only a few months before the end, right? It's late 1974, a few months before the end. Now the fourth liberal moment, I'm going to just skip this one, but it was the moment when renovation or đổi mới in Vietnam began, when Vietnam found itself in a deep crisis, political, economic. Inflation was like 700% a year, and so on. So like a lot of, and it was isolated internationally, not only by the West but also by China and the ASEAN countries. So the new parties, the most radical party leader, Lê Duẩn, he died just a few months before this could happen, and new leaders came to power and they encouraged reform. And Trần Xuân Bắc, who was a Politburo member in charge of ideology and education, He supported both economic reform and political reform. And how did he justify political reform? He said that, this is just following Lenin's thought, right, or concept, right? So, and Lenin and Stalin as well. The revolution is the business of the masses, right? Revolution is a cause of the masses. The masses must be the main players in any revolution. So he said, our country needs to change and we need to involve the masses to reform to true masses thought, to have true socialism, because we have been lying to each other. We have been lying for many years that we are building socialism, but what we're doing is not building socialism. So let's return to the true socialism. So he's not quite a Republican, but then so there's a strand of democratic strand in communist leftist kind of thought, and then he's kind of bringing that out. But he lost his position just a year later because just about the same time after Vietnamese leaders saw what happened in Eastern Europe and China, Tiananmen, with the collapse of East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary in the summer of 1989, they shut it down. So no more discussion of political reform, only economic reform, only market reform. And he lost his position. So fifth liberal moment, closest to us now, because of the looming crisis in the South China Sea with China, between China and Vietnam. The Communist Party lost its legitimacy due to corruption and deference to China. There was rising civil society after more than 2 decades of market reform. So people now could earn their living. Most people not from working for the state. So they had more freedom, and there's also the rise of the middle class in various urban centers in Vietnam. The highlights of this moment was in the 2013 constitutional reform and the 2016 self-nomination movement that my colleague New Trung also wrote an article about. So this was the protest against environmental pollution, the largest so far in Vietnam, that caused fish death across the 4 provinces in central Vietnam. So basically it's a Taiwanese company, Formosa, that invested in a steel plant in Ha Tinh and dumped its toxic waste into the ocean. The same protest led by a Catholic community, and the man in the white cap is a priest. Protesting against the Bill of Special Zones in June 2018, and there were tens of thousands of them across the country, not just here, but in Hanoi, in Ho Chi Minh City, in Nghệ An, in Bình Thuận, and many other places. The largest ever protest against the government in Vietnam. This group of about 25 intellectuals, many of them were former Communist Party leaders and 2 ministers of justice in the government who have retired. They joined together to call for constitutional reform. When the party called on the people to suggest changes to the constitution, it's just kind of a scheme they do all the time, to show public participation. But then this group, turned the table and submit really radical demands for reform. That's why it was accused as being traitors. So the proposed 2013 constitution that they submitted and was signed by 40,000 people, and it called for replacement of communist dictatorship by multi-party democracy, called for respect of private ownership, separation of powers, called for the national military not to be required to be loyal to the party, but loyal to the constitution and the nation. called for the popular ratification of the new constitution by free and secret votes. So this was 2013. But then, as usual, they were ignored and harassed a little bit, but not too bad, because they were senior intellectuals and former veterans and officials of the government, and so they were not arrested or anything, but they were just harassed. Now, what are the current challenges and prospects? I'll try to finish this in 5 or 10 minutes. Hopefully, it's okay. Okay. So there are these, totalitarian legacies. So the ruling Communist Party is still strong, and together with the mass organizations, they organize, kind of down to the neighborhood or village level. This is kind of the core of the political system. Besides the state, right? The state has the military, the police, the government, and so on. But these are the kind of political organizations that control people and survey people, monitor people, collect information, intelligence, and organize people in various political activities, the youth league, the workers' union, the women's union, like various kind of organizations. No other political organizations allow the states to control all land. 1 in 8 working Vietnamese work for domestic security forces, and the states to control all there's no freedom to publish, freedom to teach, and if you want to I was speaking at the conference in DC a few months ago, and the Vietnamese foreign minister called on America to have more understanding of Vietnamese, and both sides having more understanding of each other. And I asked the question, why don't you allow Americans to send books to Vietnam? You can't. You send books to Vietnam, they either lost or returned. You just can't. They don't allow books from US. They allow books from China, but not books from the US to be received in Vietnam. So they really screen the packages and make sure that American ideas don't get there. They're dangerous. Turning to the top leadership, there has been a lot of change in the last year or so. One leader, the top one, Tuong Vu, died in office, and 7 others were forced to resign for implications in corruption. So this is the top policy-making body of the Vietnamese Communist Party. They actually the government in shadow, right? They may not occupy a government office, but they actually the government. So the prime minister is number 7, but then he's under the party's secretary, right? Who's the top leader. And now you have the securitization of Vietnamese politics that my colleague Mitchell also have written about. 7 men from the security apparatus and 3 from the military. They are part of this 15-member body. So 2/3 of the members come from the security and the military. So it's kind of the junta, right? Military junta sort of in power in Vietnam today. So the expected changes under the new leadership. You may have heard, in the last few months, so Vietnamese government is trying to streamline the administration, merging. So they have 64 provinces, now they're merging them to form 32. So the number of provinces are now 32 or 35. And then they eliminate the district level. So between the provincial level and the village level, there's now direct authority and no longer the district level in between. So they've streamlined the administration a lot, and also talk about a new era in terms of economic development and so on. So my expectations is that we're going to see a more efficient state, but it's also be more coercive and corrupt. Even that securitization. We're going to see a more exclusive, isolated junta, depending on a single leader and a Praetorian guard, because this man, General Tolam. He was Minister of Public Security before he became the party secretary, and he was bringing men from the same provinces, like this man's from the same province. This man's from the same province. So three men from Hưng Yên province, which is a small province. It's not like a huge, very important province. Now in the Politburo, and you also see men from Hưng Yên kind of moving in the other places, other important posts in the government. So you're gonna see they forming an exclusive club that govern the country. There's also greater likelihood future leadership successions. Economic policy so far lacks substance and carries many risks. So to sum up, so I hope I'm not going so fast and lots of details to go into. If you have time, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer any questions, any details. But the main takeaways, despite promising beginnings in the 1920s with the flourishing of various ideas, Republican support for Republican institutions, Vietnam came to be dominated by a utopian and illiberal vision. And then the politics was not favorable to Vietnam, so there was this rivalry between revolutionary factions and counter-revolutionary factions that make compromising solutions not possible. So that's why Vietnam was divided into two countries, with South Vietnam backed by the US and the West, whereas North Vietnam was backed by the Soviet Union, China, and so on, and fought the war that ended 50 years ago. And during the process, the state builders, they had to deploy massive violence to keep the country together, to enforce national unity, and that's the root of all the violence in Vietnam that we have seen in the last century. And the liberal movements arrived under conditions of a regime seeking legitimacy and a strong civil society and changing international environments. And so that's kind of the takeaway. In terms of the latest changes, because you may ask when's the next liberal moment, right? So when is it coming soon or how long? Vietnamese ask me that a lot too. I don't know. Actually, yeah. I can tell they're continuing economic risk, because the government is trying to implement expansionary monetary policy. And that's going to create inflation risk and global recession. We are seeing we see maybe coming, right, to the US even. Then what else? More political instability, and the process may not yet lead to another liberal moment, but nothing is impossible. I think that's all I can say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a fantastic and rich talk. We're the stand.